Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first edition of the new Gamecity Impulse event series. I'm Maggie from Gamecity Hamburg, and in this series, we will host talks, discussion rounds, and panels on topics of equality, diversity, and inclusion. We at Gamecity Hamburg created this event series because we do support the making of games, and of course, like probably most of you watching tonight, we do play games. And probably also, like many of you, we see that while the huge group of people all over the world who play video games is diverse in so many ways, from age to gender to ethnic and religious backgrounds, we see that the communities that form around games and the teams that make the games, and sometimes even as well as the depiction of characters in games, are not always as diverse. So with this series, we hope to provide some food for thought, to start some discussions, as well as to offer industry insights on ways to improve equality, diversity, and inclusion in games. So for our first talk, we got in touch with a group of people that have been quite active in this area. So they do have quite some expertise. And that's the initiative Keinen Pixel in Faschisten. We are super happy that one of them, Beck Niederländer, is here tonight to give us some perspective on how the games we make influence society, why that makes diversity in games very important, and why video games can actually save the world. In her day job, Rebecca is producer at Mixed Vision, and tonight we are very lucky to have her with us. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. I will share my screen so you can see my presentation. And we'll get going in a second. Here we go. If everything worked correctly, you should now be able to see my title card, which says the name of my talk, Why Video Games Can Save the World. I hope my very clickbaity title lured a lot of you in here tonight. And I added my name and my Twitter handle, Rebecca tweeted, in here. So you can hit me up if you have any questions, but my contact info will also be at the end as well. So quick introduction about me. I studied game design at the Media Design Hochschule in Munich. So I have a background in game development. My bachelor thesis is about social learning through video games. And this is also what I'm basing my talk on. If anyone wants the link, I will drop it in the chat later. And you can fact check all my sources because I haven't listed every single one in here. I'm currently, as Maggie said, producer at Mixed Vision. We are doing narrative games, which is also kind of related to my interest in games saving the world, because narrative games are especially good at that, but every game is able to change the world a little bit, as I'll explain. And in my free time, when I'm not actively developing games, I also organize the Diversity Brunch together with Caroline Flesch, which is a meetup for marginalized people. And I'm also a member of Keinen Pixel in Faschisten, which means no giving no pixel to fascists. So I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. First of all, because we're going to be talking about social learning, I wanted to start with a quick definition. What is social learning? Basically, it's what we're doing right now, because social learning is something that happens all the time. It's learning how to interact with each other and learning about social interactions and how to compose yourself and how to react to others. And you do this via family, school, social environment, and media. And especially nowadays, media is more important than it was like 10 or 15 years ago, because everyone has a smartphone. Not everyone, but a lot of people have smartphones and computers and internet access. So we have a lot of media as a part of our daily life. And the basis of social learning is formed by three main components: exposure, which means that I know that something exists in the world, because otherwise I cannot learn about it. Information, which is a bit more than exposure. Just because I can see something and know it exists doesn't mean I know a lot about it. I just know what it looks like. And information means that I learn more about it. And the third and most important part is contact, which can be direct. I can meet someone from a marginalized group, and by being in touch with that person directly, learn about that group and their experiences. Or I can also have indirect contact, which is again where media comes in, because indirect contact means I might read a story about a person, or I might watch a movie that includes a person of color, and I learn something about that person. Or also because as humans like to think in patterns and generalizations, I also learn about people of color in general, because our brain tends to behave that way. And so let's talk a bit about the effects of representation in media and why it's so incredibly important. I have looked at studies that looked at literature, both popular literature and high literature, which means basically Harry Potter and Shakespeare. So these are not based on games themselves, but I strongly believe that they can be applied to games. For example, representation, which means having a character from a marginalized group in your game or movie or book, lowers prejudice just by that character existing. Of course, real life representation, meeting somebody of a marginalized group, is also a great way to lower representation. And also having like a literal person of color or a literal disabled person in your game, somebody in a wheelchair, for example, will be representation. It will lower prejudice because players get to interact with that person, or just see them and be exposed to them and get used to seeing people in wheelchairs, for example. But which I find really interesting is, while a person of color in a game or movie will only lower prejudice for people of color, fictional representation can do a lot more, because it can be interpreted in different ways, and it can be true for a lot longer than like real life representation. If one day we reach a point in society where people of color are no longer suffering from racism, a movie with a black person in it might not change anything. But a movie with, for example, as you might have noticed, the X-Men down there in it can be interpreted in different ways. And the role of the X-Men as marginalized people in their universe, or as the other image shows, an elf in Dragon Age, it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. And people might look at the very same character and the very same situation and interpret it for themselves, their own experiences, or experience of friends or other groups. And literary fiction is, as I said, the opposite of popular fiction, which means it's also called high literature sometimes. So Shakespeare and like these texts are different from popular fiction in the way that popular fiction often relies on stereotypes and quite shallow characters, while literary fiction prides itself on being a lot deeper and a lot more complex. And it makes sense, right? If a character is very stereotypical, it might not lower your prejudice towards that specific character or person. But if it's a complex character and a deep character, it will change your perception. Also, representation can heighten empathy you feel that viewers or players feel towards that group. Interestingly enough, the very least that people that consume media have to do to exhibit higher empathy is just disidentify with an evil character. The study I read took Harry Potter and let people read the books and excerpts from the books. And all they had to do, the readers, was not feel like Lord Voldemort is a good character. And it already changed their behavior towards marginalized groups, which I found very fascinating, because that is a very low bar. A whole nother talk is to be had about like anti-hero characters and people liking villains a lot these days, but I think that would maybe be a bit too much for our current talk. Also, high participation in emotional texts changes your empathy. So if you read a story an emotional, tear-jerking story about a poor little child that's right now starving in Nigeria, it will change your empathy for that very child, whom you might even know their name, a lot more than reading, okay, well, every X seconds a child starves in X country. Because our brains just work that way. If we have like a connection and a direct connection to something rather than statistics, we feel more empathy. Also, we might be prejudiced because of what media we consume, because of our environment, because of society, or have unconscious biases ourselves. And an interesting technique to heighten the empathy that we might feel towards a character or a group is not revealing that that character might not belong to the group that we think they belong to. So the outgroup, basically. Outgroup just means that the character does not belong to the group that the viewer or reader or player belongs to. For example, as you can see from the screenshots on the right, Metroid did this in quite an amazing way, because players back then were expecting that this little pixelated space explorer, of course, underneath that helmet, it has to be a man, right? Because you're shooting and fighting enemies and jumping around and you're fighting space pirates. It was epic. Of course it was a man. And then in the end, in the very ending, if you played the game and finished it in under 3 to 5 hours, the character takes off the helmet and reveals, oh, hi, Samus is actually a woman. And back then, that was a huge reveal. Of course, today everybody knows. But back then, that actually changed something, because players then had to think about, oh my god, I did all these epic things, and all along my character was a woman. And this late reveal of the character maybe not being a man and not being who they expected changes the empathy they feel, that these players might feel towards women in general. And once again, literary fiction with its deep characters and more complex characterizations also changes empathy and betters it. And in the end, representation can also directly affect behavior. And once again, the bar for this is extremely low. Once again, the example is Harry Potter. If people not only did not think he who should not be named had a point, kind of, but if they also thought that Harry was kind of a good person and maybe liked him or identified with him, that actually changes behavior in real life towards minorities. Because Harry in the books is shown to be very kind to everyone he meets and shown to be accepting of disadvantaged minorities. In this example, the house elves, he treats them as an equal and as basically human. So people who identified with Harry and thought that he was a role model also changed their behavior in real life. And once again, this might sound a bit too good to be true or exaggerated, but there's actual studies that were done, and more than one, that can prove that this happens. Unfortunately, if it's done wrong, representation can also do some damage, because it can lower your empathy. For example, if there's an emotional text that readers do not participate in and they don't feel emotions, this might lead to just not caring about the topic of the text. If it's a tearjerker and you're just not feeling it, it changes your perception of that issue or of that group and of that topic. Also, as I mentioned before, statistics are really not a good way to communicate and to make people feel empathy, because our brains just, we kind of get it, but we don't really get it on an emotional level. And also revealing that a character might not belong to the group that the player or reader belongs to, but instead belongs to another group, can also lower the empathy that readers or players feel for that character, because they know they don't belong, they're an outsider. So an early reveal hinders building empathy, while a late reveal has a lot of positive effects. And one important thing as well that's a risk when doing representation is imitation is not satire. What I mean by that is that just repeating a stereotype or repeating a harmful behavior, it does not mean that you're making a joke about that behavior. Dark humor is also no excuse for spouting racist or sexist or ableist nonsense. And one example I have here is a screenshot from a point-and-click adventure called Deponia, where players have to get a monkey costume for a black woman and then sell her to a street musician, and where everyone was like, it's just dark humor, but it's just repetition of racism, and there's no comment on it. The game doesn't contextualize the situation. It just happens. It's just a gameplay puzzle. So this does nothing good. And also, I think a good rule for asking yourself, is this dark humor that's okay, or is this imitation or repetition of a harmful stereotype? It's not a joke if you're the only one laughing. Especially a lot of us, like I myself, I'm white, I'm middle class, I live in Europe, I am very privileged. I have a very privileged position. So if I tell a joke and I'm the only one laughing, that's a good sign. That was not a really funny joke. And punching up, not down, is also an important principle to keep in mind. Having humor in your game and in your content is great. Humor is a great thing. And remembering to make jokes about people who are privileged, who have power, so punching upwards towards people in power and not punching down, for example, as in this case, punching down on women and people of color, also changes the whole context. And punching up is actually a good thing, because criticizing people in power changes things. But why are games responsible for this? Like, we have books, and obviously, as the studies show, books already do a great job. Why do I think that especially games are great for saving the world? Well, first of all, 91% of children in America play video games. And I'm using American numbers because, let's face it, unfortunately, it's the biggest market we have right now. But also in Germany, every second person plays video games. So that's a lot of people. And 21% of American players are older than 50. So the stereotype of like, it's kid stuff, or even a few years ago, people said, okay, the average gamer is 30 now, but gamers are getting older. And 46% of gamers in the USA are female. So we have a lot of women who we can market our games to. So maybe not making a super sexist game broadens your market. Then again, there's a little caveat here. Not everyone can tell every story. Just as I, as a white female from Europe, cannot tell the story of a black man living in America, there's limits to what we experience. So the best thing in an ideal world is that minorities get to tell their own stories, get to tell their own lived experiences, because they know what happened to them. Unfortunately, we do not yet live in that ideal world, and a lot of us here, if you're local to Hamburg, for example, have a lot of privilege. So let's use that privilege to amplify minority voices. And if you want to tell a story about a diverse topic, about a minority, about racism, do research. This is very obvious, but research your topic and really get into it. And if you can, hire team members from that group, hire team members who are diverse and bring different viewpoints, because this also helps know whether you're the only one laughing at a joke or whether something is insensitive to a certain group. And if you cannot hire them directly or permanently, there's great resources on the internet out there to get advisors for your team on a project basis. And also there's something called sensitivity readings, which basically also kind of means getting an advisor, getting someone to go through your material, through your game, tell you whether the story that you want to tell is coming across, and whether you're being insensitive or maybe relying on a stereotype. A lot of shows do that nowadays, TV shows, to kind of like not play into harmful stereotypes, because as these studies I mentioned earlier show, reinforcing stereotypes is very dangerous. And now some might say, or if you bring up the idea of changing the world, making diverse games and having diverse characters, you might encounter people saying, keep your social justice politics out of my games. Games are supposed to be fun. So now I have some arguments that you can bring up apart from these studies and saying, well, let's maybe make games that have characters that do not rely on stereotypes because it's just good, and it's good narrative and good games. There's some effects and arguments here. For example, there's something called the mere exposure effect. Put a pin in that. I'll come back to that on the next slide with a bit more info. But the most important thing, I think, is social learning is implicit learning. It's not something we do actively. I'm not saying that everyone should only make serious games now that have a specific message and that are meant to make you learn something. Social learning happens in every single moment that we consume media. So why not have characters that are diverse, that are complex, that are not relying on stereotypes or even archetypes sometimes, because those are basically also stereotypes. And also why I personally think that games are perfect for heightening empathy and distorting stereotypes and changing social perception is that immersion into a medium enhances the effect, enhances positive effects. As I said earlier, high participation in an emotional text heightens empathy for an outgroup. So immersion in a game is the ultimate goal, right? Because we want games to be fun. And we design narratives and emotional moments in games to really capture players. So that's perfect for teaching players to have more empathy. So back to the mere exposure effect. Basically, broken down to its very basis is, it means that normal is what we see around us, what we're used to. And interestingly, our opinions about people, things, whatever, get more positive with every additional encounter. For example, this is why so often people fall in love at work, because you see these people every day. Of course, if they're a bad person to you and not nice to you, your opinion will not get better every day, because negative interactions every day make your opinion more negative. But if it's just neutral, like if you have a colleague that you say hi to every day and you see them every day, your opinion will over time get better and you will like them more just because they're there. So this, I think, is also a great argument for having characters of color, having female characters in your game, having disabled characters in your game. Just the character being there, being visible, changes your players. And one quote that I really like when it comes to this is by Whoopi Goldberg, a very well-known Black American actor. And she says, well, when I was 9 years old, Star Trek came on. I looked at it and went screaming through the house. Come here, Mom, everybody, come quick, come quick. There's a black lady on television and she ain't no maid. I knew right then and there that I could be anything I wanted to be. And I think that really shows how important it is to have representation, to show kids, and 91% of American kids play games. So we have a lot of kids to show that they can be anything they want to be. But won't that be boring? If all our games are now politically correct and we don't use stereotypes and we design everything to be diverse and inclusive, will that not be boring? And I put 2 screenshots here from This War of Mine, which is a game that I really, really love. And I only ever played for around 2 hours and I've never touched it again because it got so hard. It emotionally, like it destroyed me so much and it was so stressful and painful emotionally that I can't continue playing, but I still love what they did because it's so brilliant and it touched me so much that I cannot play it myself. And one simple thing is, in this war of mine, you have survivors and civilians in a war zone, right? And you have inventory, you have items, but they're not called inventory. They are called our things, as you can see in the left screenshot right below the time. Our things changes the way that players think about these items. It's not just the statistic, your inventory, you have 3 medicine and this will last you X days. It's our stuff. It's our things. It changes the emotional frame. And also, I found the death screens with those Polaroids, as I put in the lower right, very effective. They're not gory. They don't show details or increasing amounts of violence, but they're very good at communicating a feeling. And it's also not just like, okay, well, character 1 is dead now, but they name them, they say, we found Marco dead. So it's again a different emotional frame and switches your brain from statistics and strategy to emotion. But my game has no opportunity for representation. This might be an argument that's a bit better against representation, but then again, there's a game called Moving Out, which is a cooperative game where players run around and move houses, basically. So you carry heavy stuff. And they have wheelchairs in their games. They have the option to customize a character, and you can put every single character in this game in a wheelchair. And it changes nothing except that they now are in a wheelchair. They can still, they still work just like every other character. You can carry stuff, you can jump. It's simple visual representation, but it changed a lot for people because they said, oh my God, I can finally see myself there. I know it can be anything. And they also added hijabs to the game, for example, as a customization option. You can put any character in a hijab. So sometimes it's just really small things. I know there's a lot of work behind everything, so I'm not saying, oh, it's super easy, but I'm saying if you want to do it, and if a jumping around moving house game can add wheelchairs, I think there's a chance, if you really want to add representation, you can. But realism is another great argument. There were no black people in medieval Europe. There are no women on the battlefield. Not quite true. If you look at realism, the current world population is around 50% women. 18% of people are Han people, which is an East Asian population, and 16% of people are black. So if we look at those numbers, we should be seeing a lot more characters that are not straight, white, mid-20, slightly stubbly men. And if you do the most basic of research with it, which is opening up Wikipedia, you get a list of over 200 women who participated in wars from 1,700 before Christ to 1,500 after Christ. So I think saying women did not participate in war is not an argument that you can really make, because they did. And these 200 women are just generals or queens, so like not 200 foot soldier women. These were leaders. So there's probably been a lot more than these 200 women. And also, I think something that we specifically in Europe have to remember is that we have been taught a quite Eurocentric worldview. And one great example, no black people in medieval times? I don't think so. We just haven't been taught about them. This was a simple Google search, and these images are also like from medieval times and even earlier. And I even found some images of cathedrals in Bavaria who have black people painted onto their walls. So our textbooks, our history books have just been whitewashed and very Eurocentric. So even that argument for not including Black people in your medieval high fantasy game doesn't really represent realism. As I said in the beginning, I want to talk a bit about Keinen Pixel, den Faschisten. I have the website on this slide, and also I will put it in the chat later. If you want to get some more info about anti-fascism work in games, this is the right address. We are a collective of game developers, of websites, of media creators in general, people who engage with games and who either develop them actively or look at them for reviews or science. And we're trying to fight fascism in games. And also, fascism often comes paired with sexism and other exclusionary beliefs. So we are in general trying to have more diversity and inclusion in games. And on the website, you can also find articles and interviews about current topics. So I think it's a great resource for more knowledge on this topic and in general. So check it out. And if you have any other questions, this slide also contains my Twitter handle and my email. And I hope everyone now goes out and saves the world with more diversity in video games.
Awesome. Many thanks, Rebecca. I think all of us who have been listening for the past 40 minutes, I think it is, now have a couple of games or movies or literature and books in mind that absolutely apply to what you just told us about. And we are very much looking forward to go into discussion about this topic with all of our viewers on our Gamecity Hamburg Discord channel, which we will also link, and in our small group right now after the talk. But first of all, thank you very much, Rebecca, for this talk. All right, and I think